What if love were not the thing that rescues you, but the thing that watches in silence as you lose yourself? What if some promises were made not to be kept, but to ensure that no one ever truly moves on? What if destiny were not a destination, but a place you return to every time you try to forget who you once were? What if there were feelings that are not born in the heart, but in places that absorb unspoken words, interrupted decisions, goodbyes that never truly happened? What if love could anchor itself in those spaces like a lingering echo, simply waiting for someone to breathe inside them again? Some questions don't arise out of curiosity. They arise because something within us already knows the answer, but refuses to accept it. There are loves that don't reveal themselves through grand gestures, but through an unsettling sense of belonging, as if the world had suddenly shrunk to fit inside a single place. What if memory were not something you carry, but something that carries you? What if forgetting were only a carefully planned interval? What if what you call a new life were just another attempt by time to make you return? Death is usually understood as a rupture, but there are stories in which it is nothing more than a pause that lasts too long. In them, love does not learn to accept the end, it learns to wait, and anything that waits long enough eventually grows roots. The road appeared as a narrow cut through the landscape. There were no signs, no clear markers, only a persistent sense of distance. Each mile traveled seemed to take something from him, not specific memories, but the familiarity of the world left behind. The sky carried a dull gray, with no promise of rain, no promise of sun. A sky that simply existed, like something watching without interfering. The car moved slowly, and the inner silence was too heavy to be attributed solely to loneliness. There was a strange anticipation there, a discomfort that didn't come from the unknown, but from premature recognition, as if some part of him already knew exactly where he was going, even while his conscious mind insisted on calling it coincidence. When the structure finally appeared among the trees, there was no surprise, no shock, only confirmation. The mansion did not stand out for exaggerated grandeur, but for the way it occupied space. It didn't seem to have been built there, it seemed to have been left there, as if it had always existed at that exact spot, waiting for the right moment to be inhabited again. The surrounding trees grew unevenly, as though avoiding direct contact with it. Even the land seemed to respect its boundaries. The iron gate was open, not broken, not forced, just open, as if it had never truly been closed. Crossing that invisible threshold, something changed, subtly but definitively. The air felt thicker, more attentive. The sound of the outside world gradually faded, as if absorbed by the space itself. Each step along the stone path produced a muted sound, almost reverent, as though the ground recognized who was walking on it. The house was watching, not like a conscious being, but like a place saturated with memory. The walls, marked by time, carried a weary dignity. The tall windows seemed too dark for the hour, reflecting more of the interior than the world outside. It was impossible to tell whether they were empty or filled with something that simply hadn't revealed itself yet. When he stopped before the front door, he didn't feel fear. He felt late, the clear, unsettling sense that he had arrived too late or too early for something already in progress. The doorknob was cold. When he touched it, his heart reacted strangely, slowing instead of racing, as if his body were adjusting to an old familiar rhythm, forgotten only on the surface. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the mansion received him with a deep silence, heavy with the scent of aged wood, fine dust, and something subtler, almost floral, like perfume kept in drawers that hadn't been opened in decades. Light filtered in, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch beyond the objects that created them. Standing there, in the center of the main hall, he felt something he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't welcome. It wasn't threat. It was recognition, as if the place knew exactly who he was, and had simply been waiting for the right moment to remind him. And as the door closed slowly behind him without noise or drama, a certainty began to take shape, slow and inevitable. He hadn't come to find something new. He had returned to something that had never stopped waiting for him. His first impression was not one of abandonment, but of restraint. The mansion felt like someone who had been holding their breath for too long to dare make a sound. It wasn't an empty house waiting for new furniture, it was an old body waiting for something specific to circulate through it again. The silence there wasn't the absence of life, it was a form of vigilance. He walked slowly through the main hall, as if trying not to interrupt an invisible ritual. The floorboards answered with spaced-out creaks, not random, but arranged as if the wood knew a script. There was the smell of old paper drifting from somewhere, mixed with a distant, dry, almost imperceptible perfume, like flowers pressed between pages and forgotten, yet still releasing their scent. The light was strange. It came through the tall windows, but seemed unable to reach certain corners. Some shadows remained even where brightness should have dissolved them. He didn't interpret this as supernatural, at least not yet, just a trait of old houses. But somewhere deep and quiet in his mind arose the impression that those shadows weren't merely architectural. It felt as though there was a deliberate care in keeping darkness in specific places. The house was too large to be comfortable, yet something about it insisted on offering intimacy, not through closeness but through familiarity, like entering a room where someone has kept your belongings for years, waiting for you to come back for them. The idea was absurd, and yet his body understood it before any thought did. He followed a long corridor. The walls were lined with frames upon frames, some small, others immense, all holding portraits that seemed to belong to the same lineage of lives, serious faces, deep-set eyes, expressions where serenity and sadness coexisted without conflict. There were no broad smiles. In nearly all of them, there was a kind of restraint, as if each person had learned too early how to live alongside loss. What unsettled him most wasn't the number of portraits, but the subtle repetition of the same kind of gaze. A gaze that didn't seem to look out of the frame, but inward, as if waiting for an event that had already happened and yet was still expected. That gaze struck him with an uncomfortable familiarity. In some frames, small golden plaques beneath the portraits bore names that were nearly illegible. Ink, varnish, time, everything had conspired to erase what could once be read. What remained were broken letters, fragments of surnames, incomplete dates, and dates he realized were often the cruelest detail of all, a reminder that time passed even when someone tried to stop it. At the end of the corridor, double doors led into a library. The air there was colder, as if paper absorbed warmth and transformed it into memory. Shelves rose to the ceiling, some so old they seemed to have been built along with the house itself. Leather-bound books, volumes with cracked spines, entire collections no one would maintain without a deeper reason. He ran his fingers along the spines, feeling the rough texture of dried leather. The dust was too fine for a place long abandoned. That caught his attention, though not enough to explain it. Someone could be maintaining it, someone could be caring for it. But the sensation was different, as if the books themselves were being handled frequently, not by hands but by some internal need of the house to keep its stories in motion. On the central table of the library stood an unlit candelabra, and beside it, a single loose sheet of paper. Just one sheet, carefully placed, as if it knew exactly where his eyes would land first. The paper was yellowed, but the ink looked recent. The handwriting was delicate and firm at the same time, like someone who writes calmly, without hesitation. The sentence was simple: "You've arrived." He stood there, reading it again and again, not because he didn't understand, but because his body reacted before his mind did. His heart didn't race. It tightened, a slow, deep tightening, as if the sentence weren't news but confirmation of something already underway. He picked up the paper carefully. When he touched it, he felt a brief cold at his fingertips, as if he had touched metal. The discomfort wasn't physical, it was emotional. The phrase "you've arrived" carried an impossible subtext to ignore. It didn't say welcome, it didn't say finally, it didn't say it's been a long time. It was too neutral, as if arrival were inevitable, as if the act itself deserved no celebration, only acknowledgement. The house seemed to listen to that moment. The silence deepened slightly, as if the air had become more attentive. He turned the paper over. There was nothing on the other side. It wasn't a long letter. It was just that. One sentence, a marker. He left the library with the paper in hand and continued exploring. The mansion had grand halls and smaller rooms, bedrooms with closed doors, corridors leading to secondary staircases. Everything seemed arranged to guide someone without pushing. The spaces didn't threaten, they suggested. And suggestion, when it comes from a place that seems to know more than you do, is more dangerous than force. When the sun began to sink, he found the kitchen. The room held old utensils, but they were clean. The table was set, as if someone had prepared a place for him. There was no food, no plate served, just the table set. And that, somehow, was more disturbing. A display of care without immediate need, a care that didn't respond to the present, but to habit. In that moment, he realized the mansion wasn't a place meant to be lived in. It was a place meant to be reclaimed. Night fell, and the silence grew thicker. The wind outside existed but seemed unable to pass through the walls. Inside, there was a very low, continuous sound, almost imperceptible, like a long breath. He tried to locate its source, but it didn't come from any single place. It seemed to exist throughout the structure, as if the house were breathing along with him. In the bedroom where he chose to sleep, the bed was impeccably made. Clean sheets, the smell of dry fabric, the sense that the space awaited him not by chance, but by necessity. And before sleep reached him, he asked a silent question, not out loud but to himself, as one does when testing whether doubt is still allowed. If he had arrived, what exactly was the house waiting for from him? He woke before realizing he was awake. It was a kind of internal alert, a waking that didn't come from thirst or a dream dissolving. It came from a sound, a low, distant sound, but rhythmic enough to impose itself on the silence of early morning. Footsteps, not hurried footsteps, not hesitant ones. slow, steady steps, like someone moving down a corridor with ancient patience, knowing every plank, every interval of creaking, every part of the floor that complained more loudly. The sound advanced with consistency, and that was more disturbing than any rush. Hurry is human. Absolute calm in the dark usually belongs to those who do not fear what they will find. He remained still for a few seconds, breath held. The room was dark, only a pale strip of light slipping through the curtains. The air was cold, but not because of the night. It was the cold of presence, of something that precedes the touch of a very old memory. The footsteps continued, now closer. His heart responded with a slow tightening, not exactly fear, but expectation, as if his body somehow recognized that rhythm. And recognition is always more dangerous than the unknown, because it doesn't allow the comfort of doubt. He sat up carefully on the bed, avoiding any sudden noise. The sound came from the corridor, just outside the door. The footsteps stopped for a moment, exactly at the level of the room. There was no knock, no attempt to open the door, just the pause, a pause too long to be accidental, a pause that seemed to contemplate. He waited, nothing happened, and then the footsteps moved away, in that same calm cadence, as if they had only confirmed something and decided to continue on. The sound grew more distant until it dissolved completely into the bones of the house, as if it had never existed at all. He stayed sitting there, hearing his own pulse in his ear, trying to convince his mind there were possible explanations. Wood settling, wind slipping through cracks, echoes in an old house. But his body didn't accept those explanations easily, because the sound hadn't been random. It had weight, it had intention, and above all it had a strange elegance, the elegance of someone who knew that route by heart. He got up and walked to the door. When he placed his hand against the wood, he felt a surface that was cold and smooth, as if it had been touched only moments ago. For a second he almost opened it, but something inside him stopped him, not fear, caution, as if memory itself were saying that certain doors should only be opened when the meaning of the gesture is fully ripe. He went back to bed, but he didn't sleep again. The night dragged forward slowly, and he began to hear the mansion differently. Small noises that had once blended into silence now felt meaningful. A distant pop, the faint tremble of a window, the nearly inaudible whisper of wind somewhere he couldn't locate, and beneath it all that continuous breathing, like the low soundtrack of existence. When morning came, he left the room with quiet care. The corridor was empty, no marks on the floor, no object out of place, only the line of portraits watching the space with their deep, restrained eyes. But something felt different, not in the paintings exactly, in the sensation, as if the mansion had accepted his presence with a deeper level of intimacy after that nighttime visit. He walked back to the library. The book he'd left open on the table was closed. He was sure he hadn't closed it. The sheet with the words "You've arrived" was gone. In its place was another page, positioned just as carefully, in the same steady handwriting. "You heard." The sentence landed like a touch at the back of his neck. There was no question, no doubt. It was a statement, as if the house wasn't only aware of the sound of the footsteps, but aware of his reaction, aware of his wakefulness. The mansion didn't simply exist around him, it followed along. He held the page for a moment, feeling the paper between his fingers like something alive. The ink looked freshly laid down. There was no musty smell, no wear. It was as if someone were writing at that very moment somewhere unseen in the house, with an intact patience. Throughout the morning, he tried to explore the wing where the footsteps had vanished before dawn. He found a secondary hallway that led to a narrow staircase, but at the top there was a locked door. There was no key nearby, and when he touched the knob, he felt a brief cold shoot up his arm, followed by a sudden sadness with no clear source. It was as if that door guarded not a room, but an old emotional state. He backed away, breathing slowly. In that moment, the mansion seemed to watch without revealing itself, as if testing boundaries, offering clues, measuring how willing he was to go deeper. In the early afternoon, he went outside to walk the grounds. The garden, though overtaken by wild growth, showed signs of recent care. Cut branches, leaves swept from certain stretches, as if someone had cleared only enough to keep the paths visible. There was the scent of old roses and damp earth. When he touched a bloom, he felt that same sharp jolt of recognition again, and an image flickered through his mind. Different hands, thinner hands, holding that same flower in a time that couldn't have been his. The image dissolved quickly, leaving only the emotion. The emotion was love, not the light love at the beginning of a story, but the heavy love of what comes after. A love that has already known loss and still insists. A love that doesn't quiet down with the passing of time, because it was built to outlast it. He went back inside carrying the sense that the mansion was doing something to him, not with force, with patience, letting the place shape him from the inside out like water working stone. And that late afternoon, climbing the hallway of portraits again, he noticed something that made him stop. One of the paintings seemed to have changed. The frame was the same, but the painted face looked sharper than before. The eyes held a more current sadness, as if they'd been retouched, and the resemblance to him, not exact but unsettlingly close, seemed stronger, as if the house were slowly building an image of him in the past, or pulling the past inside him. The second night arrived with a different weight. There was no explicit threat in the darkening, no sudden shift in the weather, but the mansion felt more withdrawn, like someone closing internal doors before revealing a secret. The air was colder, and the house's constant breathing sounded a little closer, as if it had taken a few steps toward him. He tried to stay awake for a while, sitting in the bedroom armchair, watching shadows gather in the corners. There was no hurry. The feeling that ruled him wasn't immediate fear, but expectation, the uncomfortable certainty that something was being prepared without his consent, as if the house had decided that this night would be different from the others. That was when he noticed the first change. In the corridor outside the room, there was a door that during the day hadn't drawn his attention at all. He was sure he'd passed that spot several times. It had been just another door among many, closed, discreet, indistinguishable. Now, though, it looked slightly misplaced, as if it had been inserted there after the rest of the house fell asleep. The door didn't creak. It didn't move. It simply existed with an uncomfortable presence, too quiet to ignore. The wood was darker than the others, and the knob had a dull shine, like old metal polished by hands that had repeated the same gesture for a very long time. He stepped out of the room slowly. The corridor was empty, but the silence there was different, more concentrated. Each footstep echoed in a contained way, as if sound were being absorbed before it could spread. The house seemed to track his movement with absolute attention. As he neared the door, he felt the same brief cold he was starting to recognize as a sign of rising memory. It wasn't a cold that pushed him away. It was a cold that called him in, like icy water against skin before an inevitable plunge. He opened it. The room on the other side wasn't large, but it was intense, too small for the scale of the mansion, almost claustrophobic. The walls were covered in old wallpaper with faded floral patterns, and the air held a strong scent of dried lavender mixed with aged wood, a smell that shouldn't have been so present after so long, yet persisted with an almost human stubbornness. In the center of the room stood a narrow bed, made with excessive care. On it, an old quilt, hand-embroidered, with minute details that would have required hours, maybe years of dedication. It wasn't functional. It was an object of permanence, something made to last longer than the person who created it. Beside the bed, a small table with a closed music box. He didn't touch it. He didn't have to. The mere sight of it unleashed a wave of sadness so intense he had to brace his hand against the wall to stay upright. That sadness didn't come from a recent loss. It was sedimented sadness, built up over a long time, like pain that had been shoved down and down until it became part of someone's emotional structure. The room didn't look abandoned. It looked preserved, as if it had been frozen in time, kept intact for someone who never came back, or who always came back, but never stepped inside there again. The thought hit hard enough to tighten his chest. He walked to the window. The curtains were drawn. When he touched them, the fabric felt rough under his fingers, too heavy for a small room. When he pulled them aside, he didn't find the garden or the grounds outside. On the other side, there was only total darkness, as if the room had no window to the outer world at all. It was a space turned inward. In that instant, he realized something disturbing. The room hadn't existed during the day, because it didn't need to exist. Its purpose wasn't spatial. It was emotional. It appeared only when the mind was more vulnerable, when the silence of night made it possible to reach memories the daylight kept at bay. The love living in that house was there, not as a body, not as a voice. It was there as that extreme care, that obsessive preservation, that refusal to let anything fall apart. The room was a monument to permanence, a place made not for living but for remembering. When he left the room, the corridor felt slightly different, shorter, more intimate, as if the house had drawn a little closer to him after that revelation. The door shut behind him without a sound, and when he tried to open it again, it was already gone. For the rest of the night, he couldn't sleep. Images of the room blended with sensations that weren't his, but now took up space inside him. Hands smoothing the quilt, breaths held back, promises spoken softly so as not to wake someone who no longer truly slept. By morning, the corridor was normal. No strange door, no shadow out of place, but the scent of lavender stayed on his hands, even after he washed them. And that was the most disturbing part of all, because it meant that even though the room didn't exist in daylight, it existed inside him now. The next morning brought a harsher, almost merciless light. Unlike the other days, the sun came through the windows with less filter, exposing details that had previously seemed softened by the mansion's constant dimness. The stains on the walls became more obvious, as did the small cracks in the ceiling and the uneven wear of the floor. It was as if the house, after the night's revelation, had decided to show itself with less gentleness. He walked the corridors trying to find any trace of the room that had appeared only the night before. There was no misplaced door, no visible change in the structure. The space where it should have been was occupied by an unbroken wall, cold to the touch, indifferent. And still, the scent of lavender seemed to surface now and then, faint but persistent, like a reminder that not everything that exists has to take up physical space to remain real. He found the object in the library. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't displayed with exaggerated importance. It was simply there on the central table, as if it had always belonged in that spot and was only waiting for the right moment to be noticed. A small case of dark wood, polished by time with a simple latch, no key in sight. He felt the weight of the moment before he even touched it, not through logic, but instinct. The mansion seemed too quiet, as if it were waiting for this exact approach. The air around the table was slightly colder, and the house's constant breathing sounded slower, deeper. When he opened the case, he found a ring. It wasn't a showy piece, no stones, no unnecessary shine, just a simple band of old metal, marked by tiny imperfections that gave away long use. Inside there was an inscription almost worn away, unreadable at first glance. And yet the moment he saw it, something hit him, immediate and deep. Like the object carried far more weight than its shape suggested. Love showed itself there with unexpected force, not as tenderness, but as responsibility. As a bond that doesn't ask permission to exist. The ring didn't call up specific memories, but it awakened a painful certainty. He wasn't merely a witness to that story. He was an active part of it. The object demanded a stance as if it refused to be observed neutrally. He held the ring between his fingers and felt the metal's cold spread across his skin, climbing up his arm with a near-ceremonial slowness. Images began to form, fragmented, incomplete, but too intense to ignore. A gesture repeated countless times, trembling hands. A moment when the decision had been made not from clarity, but from an absolute terror of loss. The mansion answered with a soft, almost respectful crack. Not approval, not disapproval, recognition, as if the object had finally been accepted by the one who needed to accept it. He tried to put the ring back in the case, but hesitated. Something in him resisted the idea of returning it to silence. Not because he wanted to wear it, but because he understood, still dimly, that the ring was an anchor. While it stayed there, untouched, the story would remain suspended. To touch it, to accept it, meant starting something irreversible. The conflict began there, still in Act 1, quietly, almost imperceptibly. The tension didn't come from an outside threat, but from the realization that the mansion would never demand anything outright. It would simply place the right elements in front of him at the exact right moment, letting him step deeper and deeper on his own. All day, the ring remained on the table. He passed by it several times, feeling its presence even when he didn't look directly at it. It was as if the object reorganized the space around it, making everything slightly more intimate, more saturated with meaning. By late afternoon, he noticed the portraits in the hallway looked different again. Some gazes now felt less distant, more attentive, not threatening, just involved. As if they recognized in that object the sign that something was finally beginning to move. When night drew close, he left the ring where it was, not out of final refusal, but because he needed time. Time in that house still obeyed the mansion's logic, slow, patient, inclined to wait until natural resistance wore thin. And as darkness began to gather in the corners again, one certainty formed with uncomfortable clarity. That ring wasn't meant to be kept. It was meant to be claimed. Night arrived without a sound, as if it had been carefully laid over the mansion so it wouldn't wake what was already awake. Shadows grew with calculated slowness, filling empty spaces with something that wasn't exactly darkness, but density. The air felt thicker, as if each breath required a silent agreement with the place. He sensed the shift before any clear sign. There were no footsteps this time, no groan of wood, no door moving. What settled in was more disturbing, the unmistakable feeling that he was no longer alone anywhere in the house, even when no other body occupied the space. The presence didn't come from behind him or from some dark corner. It seemed to exist all around, diffuse, constant, like an invisible field adjusting to his movements. Wherever he went, something seemed to move along with him, not to follow, but to accompany. There was an excessive, almost intimate care to it that made it impossible to ignore. He tried to stay in the bedroom, but the stillness there grew too heavy. Every object felt charged with attention. The armchair where he'd sat the night before now seemed slightly out of place, as if someone had occupied it for a while and then stood up carefully. The bed was untouched, but the air around it felt too warm for the hour. When he stepped into the hallway, the change hit immediately. The space felt shorter, closer, as if the mansion had adjusted its interior proportions to reduce the distance between him and whatever watched him. The portraits on the walls reflected the light differently, and for a moment he had the impression that some eyes had changed direction. They didn't move, but they felt less far away, more aware. The presence showed itself through small concessions. Doors opening before he touched them, a corridor brightening faintly when he hesitated. The house's constant breathing becoming more rhythmic, almost syncing with his heartbeat. There was no aggression. There was involvement. In the library, the feeling intensified. The ring was still on the table, exactly where he'd left it. But something about it felt different. Not physically, by meaning. As if it had absorbed the house's attention all day long, carrying it like a silent charge. He approached without touching it. He didn't need to. The presence seemed to condense there, in that precise point of the room. The air was colder, but there was also a strange sense of protection, as if that place were an emotional center of the mansion. Not a heart that beats, but a core that preserves. In that moment, an almost complete memory tried to surface. Not a clear image, but an entire emotion, too complex to translate into words. The feeling of having promised something in a moment of absolute desperation, of having believed with total conviction that the gesture had been the only way to keep breathing. The love there wasn't light. It was urgent. It was a choice made with the force of someone who believes losing would be worse than any future consequence. He pulled away from the table with effort, feeling the weight of that emotion spread through his body. The presence didn't insist. It didn't have to. The mansion seemed confident that first contact had already been enough to shift something inside him. Back in the hallway, he saw that one of the doors that had been locked before was now slightly ajar. Not the door to the room that appeared at night. Another one, more discreet, almost hidden behind a darkened panel. A silent invitation, not an order. The house didn't demand urgency. It knew that each step taken without resistance made the next one inevitable. As he neared that door, he felt the familiar brief cold, paired with a deep sadness, but now something new was braided into it. Tenderness. A strange, displaced tenderness, like someone who had waited too long for that moment, and could finally accept closeness without trying to hold it by force. He didn't open the door, not yet, but as he stepped away, he understood something that subtly rearranged everything he'd felt up until then. The presence didn't want to frighten him. It didn't want to drive him away or trap him by force. It wanted to be recognized. It wanted to exist without having to hide behind objects and corridors. The love living in that house was starting to become more explicit, and that made it more dangerous than any veiled threat, because it's hard to run from something that presents itself as care. And that night, while the mansion breathed around him with an intimacy that was almost unbearable, he realized that the true beginning of the story wasn't his arrival at the house. It was the exact moment when love stopped being only memory and began demanding conscious presence. He didn't find the records by accident. Nothing in that house happened by accident. The half-open door in the side corridor seemed to exist solely to guide him, and when he crossed the threshold, it felt like stepping into a space that wasn't waiting for curiosity, but recognition. The room was narrow and long, with a ceiling too low for the rest of the mansion. The walls were lined with dark wooden cabinets, all closed, each marked with small hand-carved symbols. They weren't dates or full names. They were repeated marks, as if someone had developed a private language to catalog something that couldn't be named directly. The air was drier, thick with old dust and something metallic, the smell of aged paper mixed with old ink. There were no windows. The light came from a single weak bulb, casting shadows too long for such a tight space. Every step echoed louder there, as if the room wasn't used to conscious visitors. He opened the first cabinet carefully. Inside were boxes arranged with near-obsessive precision. Each box held notebooks, loose pages, small personal items. These weren't ordinary keepsakes. They were records, documentation of lives. When he opened one of the notebooks, the impact was immediate. The handwriting was his. Not his current hand, but unmistakable in its slant, its habits, its unconscious choices. The pages didn't tell one continuous life. They were fragments, short entries written at different times, with irregular gaps. Some described the house with early bewilderment, others with deep intimacy. In all of them, there was an unsettling pattern, the repeated arrival, the initial confusion, the sense of recognition without clear memory. He flipped faster, his heart speeding as understanding drew closer. Different dates, different centuries. In some records, the handwriting was stiffer, older. In others, smoother, more modern. But the content followed the same emotional arc: arrival, entanglement, promise. The promise. In almost every notebook it appeared indirectly, as something that didn't need explanation because it had already been accepted. Lines like, "I can't let it end, we're safe here, the world outside doesn't matter." And in later records, the same sentence showed up again and again with slight variations, like a mantra written to persuade its own author. A chill climbed his spine. This wasn't just preserved memory. It was a documented cycle. The mansion didn't simply wait for him. It recorded each return, each attempt to rebuild the bond, each failure to allow an ending. In another box, he found something even more disturbing, personal objects he recognized without being able to place them in time. A broken watch, an embroidered handkerchief with faded initials, a loose button, far too old for any clothing he remembered owning. They weren't random symbols. They were remnants of lives that had crumbled inside that same space. The presence thickened there, not distant observation but silent closeness. He could feel with almost physical clarity that the room was too intimate to enter without consequences. Every record he read drew closer not only memory but responsibility. In a deeper cabinet, he found a different set of boxes. They didn't hold notebooks. They held letters, all written in that same delicate handwriting that appeared on the pages the house left behind. Letters with no explicit recipient, and yet all of them were addressed to him, not to the man standing there now, but to the essence that returned. The letters didn't beg. They didn't accuse. They spoke of waiting, of adapting, of small changes made to the mansion with every return so it could fit him better. They spoke of love with a patience that bordered on contained despair. Love that had learned to survive repeated forgetting, so long as it could be reignited when he came back. He closed one letter with trembling hands. Understanding began to form with unbearable weight. The mansion wasn't only a place of memory. It was a mechanism, a system carefully maintained to ensure that love never disappeared completely, even if to do it, it had to fracture his identity again and again. As he stepped away from the cabinet, vertigo washed over him. Not physical, existential. How many times had he been here? How many versions of him had accepted the promise without grasping the full cost? How many times had love been confused with absolute permanence? The presence answered that inner question with an even deeper silence. No defense, no justification. Only the fact that it had all been done out of love, and that love, when it refuses to accept an ending, becomes a prison without realizing it. He left the room with difficulty, feeling the weight of the record settle inside him as something irreversible. When he closed the door, he realized it locked itself. Not as punishment, but as acknowledgement that the space didn't need to reveal itself again yet. The mansion seemed to breathe more slowly, and as he walked back toward the main hall, one certainty sharpened with frightening clarity. Act 1 was coming to an end. What followed would no longer be about discovery. It would be about choice. After he closed the door to the records room, something changed for good. It wasn't visible or immediate, but a deep adjustment in how the mansion related to him. The space felt more aware of its own presence, less interested in hiding behind symbols and ambiguous corridors. The love holding that place together had been seen, and once seen, it no longer needed to suggest itself so delicately. The silence became different. Not the silence that watches, but the silence that wraps around you. Every step across the main hall came with a constant closeness, as if the air were slightly warmer around him. There was no sound of breathing now. Something subtler replaced. The sense that the whole space adjusted to the rhythm of his body, as if it were trying to walk with him, not behind him. The romance, if it could still be called that, stopped being only atmosphere. It became bond. He felt it for the first time as he crossed the music room. The piano, which until then had remained covered, was now uncovered. There were no handprints in the cloth, no sign of sudden movement. The cover simply wasn't there anymore. The black and white keys caught the window light with an almost intimate softness. There was no explicit invitation to play, but the feeling was clear this belonged to his story. As he moved closer, an emotion rose that mixed comfort and loss. Like stepping into a place where something important had happened so many times the room had learned to remember on its own. He rested his hand on the closed lid of the piano and felt the wood's coldness slowly turn into warmth, as if the object responded to touch not through magic, but through emotional habit. The mansion didn't push. It didn't demand he play, or claim the ring, or open new doors. What it did now was more dangerous. It offered belonging. The sense that inside those walls, everything made sense, that the outside world was too chaotic to understand what existed in that silent, persistent bond. He began to notice small gestures of care scattered throughout the house. A glass of water left on a table where he'd lingered a little longer. A window opened in a room where the air had grown heavy. None of it was spectacular. It was all too intimate, like living with someone who knows your habits better than you do, and it stirred an almost complete memory. Not a clear image, but an entire emotional sequence. The memory of choosing that house as a refuge, of believing it would be possible to build a smaller, controlled world there, one where love wouldn't have to compete with life's unpredictability. From the beginning, the mansion had been a project of protection, and protection, when it's born from fear, learns quickly to confuse care with containment. The bond deepened as he understood that, not because the house forced him to accept it, but because recognition creates an inevitable intimacy. Seeing the mechanism didn't dismantle it right away. It made it more real, harder to break. That night when he laid down, something was different. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no room appearing out of nowhere. What there was absolute closeness, the feeling that there was no distance at all between him and what loved him, not as a body, but as an emotional state. Sleep came heavy and deep, loaded with dreams that showed no scenes, only whole feelings, safety, wholeness, the seductive idea that inside those walls he would no longer have to choose, fail, or lose. The mansion offered a world where love never had to prove itself because it would never be challenged. When he woke, the conflict began to take shape with painful clarity, because he understood now that the bond wasn't fake. The love was real, deep, persistent. And precisely because of that, it was dangerous. It wasn't an easy illusion to reject. It was a possible choice, and a comfortable one. Act 2 moved forward with a new weight. The danger didn't come from horror. It came from temptation. The mansion didn't want to trap him by force. It wanted him to choose to stay. And that choice was starting to feel easier than he wanted to admit. The first thing he noticed wasn't absence, but softening. The world outside the mansion didn't vanish all at once. It began to lose sharpness, like a landscape seen through fogged glass. Sounds that used to arrive clearly now felt distant, delayed, like echoes of something that no longer demanded an answer. The house didn't lock external doors. It simply made them feel unimportant. He realized it when he opened an upstairs window. The city in the distance was still there, but it looked smaller, less defined, set at a distance that didn't match physical reality. The streets, the rooftops, the movement. Everything existed, but without urgency, without pull. It was like looking at an old theater set after the play ends, recognizable but drained of immediate meaning. The mansion, on the other hand, felt more alive than ever. The corridors no longer seemed too long. They had exact, comfortable proportions, almost designed for his stride. The air moved gently, adjusting to a human presence like an organism finding its natural rhythm again. The persistent chill was gone. In its place was a stable, welcoming warmth that made the inside more appealing than any promise beyond it. The bond deepened in everyday details. He began to lose a precise sense of time, not because the clock was broken, but because hours stopped asserting themselves. The day passed without clear breaks. There was no morning that demanded a beginning, no night that demanded an ending. Everything arranged itself into a calm continuity, almost seductive. The library became his frequent refuge, not to search for answers but to remain. He sat in an old armchair, feeling the leather give under his weight, and stayed there for long stretches without reading, simply breathing. The books around him seemed satisfied with that quiet presence, as if the mere act of being there completed something that had been missing for far too long. At some point that day, or maybe another, it was hard to tell, he realized he no longer felt the need to leave. The idea of crossing the gate, of driving the road again, felt distant, almost abstract. There was no prohibition, no fear, only the sense that it wasn't necessary. Everything that mattered seemed contained within those walls. That realization frightened him, not immediately, but with a cold lucidity. He recognized the pattern, the excessive comfort, the way the house replaced the world little by little, not through force, but through emotional efficiency. The mansion didn't take anything from him. It simply offered something better, or at least something that felt better in that moment. The love sustaining that place now showed itself as absolute steadiness. There were no highs and lows, no conflict, no risk. A love that stayed the same no matter what happened. And that, he began to understand, was part of the problem. Love without risk doesn't demand growth. It doesn't demand adaptation. It doesn't demand accepting an ending. He tried to remember what the world had been like before he arrived. The memories came up fragmented, less accessible. Faces without names, streets without detail, voices without a defined tone. Nothing seemed wrong with those memories. They simply couldn't compete with the mansion's immediate presence. The outside past was starting to lose its specific weight. Late that afternoon, walking the hallway of portraits, he noticed another subtle change. Some paintings looked brighter, more defined. Others, strangely, were beginning to fade. Not all of them, only those that seemed older, more distant. The house was reorganizing its narrative, favoring whatever remained useful to the present. He stopped in front of a portrait that tightened something in his chest. The painted face held an expression too serene for someone who had spent so long waiting. And yet there was a deep resignation in that gaze, as if the person had accepted that for love to keep existing, it had needed to close itself off from the world. Understanding moved forward with growing weight. The bond wouldn't imprison him with visible chains. The imprisonment would happen through the gradual reduction of alternatives, through the increasingly comfortable idea that nothing beyond those walls could offer the same level of meaning. The mansion wasn't isolating him from the world, it was making him indifferent to it. And that indifference was the clearest sign of danger. That night, when he lay down, he felt the absolute presence again, not as observation, but as total closeness. The sense that there were no clear borders between him and the house, as if the space had adjusted to receive him not as a visitor, but as a structural part of itself. Before he drifted off, one thought crossed his mind with a clarity that didn't allow postponement. If he stayed there long enough, there would be no conscious return. And in recognizing that, he understood Act 2 wasn't moving toward an external confrontation, but toward an unavoidable internal dilemma: accept eternal comfort, or choose necessary loss. The decision to try to leave didn't form as a plan. It was a sudden impulse, almost instinctive, like a defensive movement that happens when the body senses a threat before the mind can name it. He got up on a morning with no defined hour, crossed the main hall without pausing over details, and walked toward the front door with a quiet determination that wasn't courage, it was urgency. The doorknob was where it always was, cold, solid, real. When he touched it, nothing happened at first. No shock, no warning, no sudden shift in the atmosphere. The mansion didn't push back, and that paradoxically unsettled him even more. The door opened. Outside, the road was there, the trees, the land, the sky. Everything looked intact. No visible distortion, no physical barrier. He stepped out, feeling the outside air touch his face with a strange sensation, not full freedom but displacement, like crossing a border that no longer recognized him completely. On the second step, something subtle happened. It wasn't pain, it wasn't force, it was memory. A wave of remembrance surged through his body with silent violence, not isolated images, but whole sensations: the mansion's absolute safety, love's steadiness, the absence of risk. The contrast was immediate. The world outside suddenly felt too large, too unpredictable, almost hostile in its openness. He stopped. A third step didn't come, not because the house pulled him back, but because something inside him hesitated hard enough to freeze him in place. The bond, now active, didn't show itself as a prison, but as an irrefutable emotional argument. Leaving meant giving up something that, inside those walls, would never be taken from him. He tried to take a deep breath. The outside air felt thinner, harder to hold. His body reacted as if it were being deprived of something essential, not oxygen, but meaning. The world wasn't rejecting him. It simply wasn't welcoming him in the same way. When he looked back, the mansion stood at a different angle, not threatening, not hostile, just still, waiting. There was no desperation in it, no attempt to stop him. The house looked absolutely confident that this attempt wouldn't be completed, and it wasn't. He stepped backward, then another step. The door stayed open, no creak, no protest. When he crossed the threshold again, he felt the air adjust around his body with immediate familiarity. His breathing deepened, his heart slowed, the discomfort faded as if it had never been there. The door closed on its own behind him, not as punishment, as conclusion. He stood in the main hall for a long time, feeling the weight of that experience settle in slowly. There was no explicit failure, no clear defeat. Only a fact: the bond was already strong enough to make freedom feel uncomfortable. The mansion didn't need to lock him in. It only had to make the outside world emotionally incompatible. Walking the corridors again, he realized something had changed. Not in the objects, not in the structure. It had changed in him. The attempt to leave had left a residue of inner tension, as if a line had been crossed and recorded. The portrait seemed to watch him with a different kind of attention now. There was no reproach, there was understanding, as if they knew every attempt to leave was part of the process, as if that gesture had already been repeated countless times before. And then he felt a deep sadness, not directed at the house but at himself. How many times had he tried to leave like that? How many times had he believed he was choosing, when in truth he was already too integrated to go without pain? By the end of that day, the mansion seemed quieter than ever. There were no excessive gestures of care, no objects repositioned. It was as if love had pulled back a little, confident, letting him feel the full weight of his own choice. And in that silence, understanding became unavoidable. The bond wouldn't be broken by a simple decision. Wanting to leave wasn't enough. He would have to confront what made staying so comfortable. The first attempt to leave hadn't been failure. It had been a warning. Act 2 moved toward its most critical point. After the attempt, the mansion didn't celebrate. It didn't offer extra comfort or intensify its careful gestures. If anything, it withdrew emotionally, like someone stepping back so the other person can feel, without interference, the weight of their own decision. The lack of reaction was, in itself, an answer. He began to notice the cost of staying not in major events, but in small, almost invisible losses. The first was time. Not just the difficulty of counting days or hours, but the sense that time had stopped being a line moving forward. It had become a closed, circular space where everything existed at once without truly advancing. Meals happened without clear hunger. Sleep came without fatigue. Waking brought no anticipation. Life inside the mansion was beginning to organize itself around maintenance, not progress. And that, while comfortable, carried a quiet sadness he only started to recognize when he tried to remember what he'd wanted before he ever arrived. His desires weren't gone. They were dulled. He tried to write. He took paper and pen from the library, sat at the table where so many letters had appeared, and tried to record his own thoughts. something that wasn't memory and wasn't reaction to the house. The words came, but they felt generic, hollow, as if urgency were missing. It was hard to write about a future when the present demanded no movement. Now the mansion showed its other face, not love that insists, but love that numbs, a love that protects so much it prevents growth, that removes conflict at the cost of vitality. Staying meant trading real intensity for eternal stability. He started to notice changes in his body, not aging, but stagnation, small marks that didn't progress, wounds that neither fully healed nor worsened. His body seemed suspended in an in-between state, kept functioning but denied transformation. The portraits reflected it. Some faces now looked more like him, not physically, but in expression. The same gaze of someone who stopped expecting something new, replacing anticipation with resigned acceptance. There was no explicit suffering in those images. There was quiet surrender. One unusually silent afternoon, he sat on the floor of the main hall and let himself feel all of it without resistance. The mansion didn't react. It didn't try to comfort him. It simply remained, the love holding the place. Together seemed to understand this was necessary, that recognizing the cost of staying mattered as much as recognizing the danger of leaving. Understanding came slowly, but it held. Staying meant disappearing little by little, not as a body, but as possibility. The outside world wouldn't call him anymore because he would stop having anything to answer. The mansion's love wouldn't destroy him. It would simply keep him the same forever. And that was the real price. He got up with difficulty, a new weight in his chest. Not fear, not panic, responsibility. The awareness that any choice from that point on would be final in a different way. There was no neutrality left, no comfortable postponement. Act 2 moved closer to its breaking point, because now he understood, with painful clarity, that the love keeping him there had never meant to set him free, but it also hadn't meant to hurt him. It meant to preserve him, even if that meant preventing him from continuing to live. The realization didn't arrive as a sudden revelation, but as accumulation, an understanding formed from small details that, on their own, would mean nothing but together outlined a carefully built mechanism. The mansion wasn't just an emotional shelter, it was a system, an organism designed for a single purpose, to prevent something from reaching an end. He saw it when he returned to the records room. The door that had once locked itself now opened with unsettling ease, as if the house had decided he was ready to see more. Inside, the air was even drier, thick with an old stillness, as though the space had been preserved not only from time, but from change. The cabinets revealed new compartments he hadn't noticed before. Hidden drawers, false bottoms, internal divisions too meticulous to be improvisation. Every detail suggested planning. There was no blind desperation here. There was method. The love sustaining the mansion had learned across returns how to become structure. Among the records, he found something different from the usual notebooks. Diagrams, hand-drawn sketches of the mansion itself, with precise notes about hallways, rooms, staircases. They weren't ordinary floor plans. They were emotional maps. Certain spaces were labeled stable, others sensitive. Some necessary only at the beginning. The room that appeared only at night was there, drawn in thin, almost timid lines accompanied by a brief note. Activate only when resistance decreases. Something tightened in his chest. The house didn't react only to his physical movement. It reacted to his emotional state. It adjusted according to how close the bond was, according to how willing he was to remain. The system was adaptive. Over time, it had learned how to offer exactly what was needed to prevent rupture. There were also records of failures. Attempts to leave noted with almost scientific care. Emotional reactions cataloged. First exit, bodily rejection. Second exit, loss of meaning. Third exit, voluntary return. Each line was a cruel reminder that the cycle had been tested, adjusted, refined across countless lives. He understood then that the mansion didn't merely wait for him to choose to stay. It created the ideal conditions for any alternative to become unsustainable. The outside world didn't need to be denied. It only had to be compared, and it would always lose. Love here had become an engineer. That understanding added a new layer of conflict. There was no longer any way to romanticize the situation as simple emotional attachment. There was intention. Even if born from fear, even if sustained by real affection, the structure was control perfected precisely because it never presented itself as control. He stepped away from the cabinets with effort, feeling the weight of the revelation settle as something irreversible. If the mansion was a system, then staying meant accepting his own final integration. There would be no further attempt to leave that wouldn't be anticipated, absorbed, neutralized. Walking the corridors after that, everything looked different. Not hostile, but functional. Every door, every staircase, every room existed with a specific purpose inside that mechanism. The house wasn't a passive setting. It was an ongoing strategy. and the most disturbing part was realizing that, at some point in the past, it had been him who started it. Not out of cruelty, not out of a desire to imprison, but out of an absolute inability to accept an ending. The love that created the system didn't want to dominate. It wanted to survive. That night he couldn't sleep, not from fear but from clarity. Understanding was too heavy to make room for easily. Act 2 was nearing its close with an unavoidable truth. There would be no simple exit, no silent escape. Breaking the system would require something more radical than leaving. It would require letting love face the one thing it had always avoided, a real ending. And in recognizing that, he knew the next step wouldn't be imposed by the mansion. It would be chosen by him. Identity had always felt too solid to him before he entered that house. Something continuous, coherent, built over time like a straight line of decisions and experiences. Now that notion was slowly coming apart, revealing something more fragile, more unsettling. Who he was had been reshaped again and again to fit inside that place. He began to notice it in his own thoughts. Certain reactions arrived too quickly, like conditioned reflexes. The automatic pull toward comfort in silent corridors. The tendency to justify staying with arguments that sounded too reasonable to have been born there, in that moment. They weren't new ideas, they were inherited mental habits. The records made it clear. Each return didn't erase everything, only enough. What remained was reconfigured to guarantee quick adaptation. Tastes, fears, ways of handling loneliness. Everything was adjusted to make the mansion not just tolerable but necessary. His identity wasn't destroyed, it was edited. That recognition brought a different kind of pain, not the pain of captivity, but the pain of realizing he had helped build his own cell. Not as a conscious accomplice, but as someone who, in each life, accepted small concessions in exchange for immediate relief. The system didn't need to impose dramatic losses. It only had to slowly remove whatever made him able to leave. He walked to one of the old mirrors scattered through the house. The surface was slightly clouded, the reflection distorted enough to prevent a clean image. And still, he recognized himself. The face was his. The eyes, though, seemed to hold layers that belonged to more than this one life. There was a strange depth there, as if several versions of him were looking at once. The question rose with unavoidable force. Who would he be without the mansion? Not who he'd been before, because that before was already contaminated by earlier returns. The question was more radical. Who could he become if he allowed all those versions to end at once? No return, no repetition, no safety of unconscious restart. No answer came, and that was part of the problem. The mansion had always offered ready-made answers. Stay, return, rebuild. Now, for the first time, the absence of an answer demanded genuine creation. And creating something new meant accepting the risk of failure, solitude, irreversible loss. He realized then that breaking the cycle wouldn't only mean destroying the external system, it would mean dismantling the identity the system had shaped, renouncing the version of himself that had learned how to survive without changing, accepting that everything that had become comfortable would have to be questioned. The love sustaining the mansion didn't respond with hostility to that understanding. If anything, there was a quiet sadness in the air, as if the place recognized this was the exact point where the bond became unsustainable. The system had worked too well for too long. Now it was beginning to conflict with the consciousness he was recovering. Throughout that day, he started to feel small failures in the structure, not physical cracks, but emotional lapses, moments when comfort didn't arrive with the same force, instants when the house seemed to hesitate, as if it didn't know how to respond to thoughts that had never been recorded before. Those lapses weren't punishment, they were limits. The system had been built to prevent endings, not to handle someone willing to accept them consciously. The mansion knew how to preserve, it didn't know how to free. The afternoon moved on in silence, and he felt the weight of the decision drawing closer with uncomfortable clarity. There was no longer any way to delay, no further discovery that could justify waiting. Act 2 was nearing its definitive turning point. Breaking the cycle would require a gesture the system couldn't absorb, something that couldn't be reinterpreted as return, something that would end not only the bond, but the mansion's very logic. And in understanding that, he felt for the first time not fear, but anticipated grief, not only for the love that would be released, but for every version of himself that would never exist outside that loop. He didn't get there through clear directions, or a map tucked among the records. He got there because something in the mansion stopped responding, a sudden emptiness almost imperceptible, like a word disappearing from a sentence and meaning beginning to fail. That failure guided him. The corridor that led him there was older than the rest of the house. The walls felt thicker, the light more uneven, and the air carried the smell of damp stone that didn't belong anywhere else in the mansion. There were no signs of recent adaptation in that stretch, no emotional concessions, no fine-tuning. It was a space left outside the system's constant improvement. There, comfort didn't work. He felt it immediately. The temperature didn't adjust to his body. The silence didn't wrap around him. There was no sense of belonging, only raw presence. The kind of presence that neither consoles nor threatens but demands full attention. Every step landed with uncomfortable clarity, as if the space returned him to himself exactly as he was, without filters. At the end of the corridor, he found a stone door, heavy, with no visible handle. Unlike the others, it didn't look made to open and close often. It was a boundary, not symbolic, but structural. When he touched it, he didn't feel the familiar cold that carried memory or tenderness. He felt something drier, limit. When he crossed it, he understood the space beyond wasn't a normal room. There was no furniture, no objects, no carefully preserved symbols. It was a wide, irregular chamber, as if it had been carved out rather than built. The walls were raw stone marked by old cracks that had never been repaired. The ceiling was too high, and the echo of his own breathing came back with no softening. Here, the system didn't narrate. There were no records, no letters, no care. It was the only place in the mansion where love had never learned how to become structure. Maybe because this was where the one thing it always avoided lived, the end, not as an idea, but as a real possibility. The room seemed to exist to remind him that not everything can be preserved, no matter how hard you try. A different weight settled in his chest as he stood there, not the mansion's comforting weight, and not the pressure of closed corridors. It was the weight of existence, without mediation, the awareness of himself without the system's cushioning. And it was there that the memories began to align differently, not as repeated fragments, but as a continuous sequence. He remembered not only the first promise, but the exact moment he decided he would not allow an ending. The memory came without romance, no internal music, no softened emotion, only the raw desperation of someone who had mistaken loving for preventing loss. And at the same time, he remembered every time he'd returned without knowing, every version of himself that had accepted small concessions in exchange for peace. Here, for the first time, he felt all of it without anesthesia. The system couldn't operate in that space because there was no way to soften what it meant. The mansion had been built to preserve, to protect, to hold. That room existed to let something end, and that was incompatible with the entire logic wrapped around it. He understood then that he didn't need to destroy the whole house. He didn't need to fight the system down every corridor. He only had to begin the ending there, where the mechanism couldn't reabsorb the gesture or reinterpret it as another return. The love that sustained the mansion felt distant at that point. Not absent, but unable to fully manifest, like someone watching from far away, knowing they can't intervene without losing everything. There was sadness in it, not anger, not resistance, just the belated awareness that what had been built to last would not survive the acceptance of an ending. He stayed there a long time, letting the real silence of that room settle in. It was uncomfortable, lonely, honest. Every second spent there weakened the system's logic, because the system depended on avoiding that kind of unfiltered presence. And it was there, without witnesses, without records, without any promise left to make, that he made the decision none of the other versions of him had ever managed to make. He didn't decide to leave yet, he decided to end the cycle, end the promise, end the need to return. Act 3 moved forward now, with no room for retreat. The reaction wasn't immediate. There was no quake, no violent cracking, no dramatic collapse of walls. What spread first was something subtler, and because of that, more unsettling: sadness. A deep structural sadness that seemed to seep slowly through every corridor, every room, like dark water finding invisible cracks. He felt it even inside the stone chamber. The air grew heavier, not with oppression, but with emotional density. It was as if the entire mansion understood at once that something essential was being taken from it, not by an outside attack, but by an internal choice. And that difference changed everything. When he left the chamber, the old corridor seemed longer, not as a way of stopping him, but like someone walking too slowly because they don't want to reach the end of a path. The walls no longer leaned toward him. They didn't try to adjust. They stayed rigid, almost indifferent, as if the system for the first time had no adequate response. The portraits reacted. They didn't move, they didn't fall, but something in them shifted, almost imperceptibly. Expressions grew duller, less defined. Some faces seemed to fade, not from time passing but from losing their function. The narrative that kept them relevant was beginning to unravel. The mansion was grieving, and it wasn't staged. There was no attempt to manipulate him. No explanatory letters appeared, no carefully chosen memories meant to convince him to stop. The system seemed to understand that kind of insistence wouldn't work here. All that was left was to feel. He walked through the main hall with a new kind of attention. The space felt larger, but also emptier. Objects that once held intense meaning now looked like objects. The armchair where he'd spent hours in silence no longer pulled at him. The library didn't offer automatic refuge. The piano was still there, but it didn't evoke belonging. The house was learning something it had never been designed to learn, to lose. It wasn't quick, it wasn't clean. It was real mourning, distributed throughout the structure. The mansion had been built to prevent endings, Now it faced a conscious ending, something it had no defense against. He felt compassion. Not for the house as an entity, but for the love that had held it together for so long. A love that had never learned to accept an ending, and so had learned to make itself eternal by force. Now it was being made to feel what it had always avoided, the slow arrival of absence. Night fell with a deeper darkness than the nights before. There was none of that intimate, sheltering feeling. The dark felt raw, almost indifferent. The mansion didn't wrap itself around him anymore. It simply existed around him, like any old building passing through its last moments of relevance. When he lay down, he realized sleep didn't come easily, not from anxiety, but because silence no longer offered comfort. This was a silence that demanded conscious presence, not surrender. The weakened system no longer rocked him into convenient dreams. And in that uneasy wakefulness, he understood something essential. Beginning the ending didn't mean finishing everything at once. It meant allowing the process to happen without trying to interrupt it. Allowing the mansion to grieve, because preventing grief would only restart the cycle of holding on. The love he found inside had never meant to set him free because it had never learned to suffer an ending. Now it was being forced to learn, not out of cruelty but necessity. In the early hours he heard footsteps in the corridors again, not slow like before, not watchful. They were uncertain, offbeat, like someone walking without knowing where to go after losing the only destination they'd ever known. And hearing that, he didn't feel fear. He felt confirmation that the ending had finally begun. The reorganization started, almost imperceptibly, as if the mansion were testing possibilities, trying responses it had never needed before. There was no rush, no panic. The system that had sustained that place for so long still worked, but now it ran without conviction, like someone repeating familiar motions without believing in the outcome anymore. He noticed it first in the smallest details. A corridor that started to feel a little too welcoming again. A room that regained the faint scent of lavender. A chair placed exactly where he used to stop when he'd been thinking too long. They weren't demands, they were offers. The mansion wasn't trying to trap him anymore. It was trying to negotiate. The love holding it together had learned something new during that first stretch of suffering. Maybe it didn't have to prevent the end completely. Maybe it only had to delay it. Maybe it could turn the ending into coexistence, not absolute permanence, but occasional return. A more flexible promise, a less rigid cycle. That attempt at adaptation was, in a way, more dangerous than the previous system, because now it didn't look like a prison. It looked like an agreement. He moved through the spaces feeling that adjustment happen around him, like a silent conversation. The house seemed to ask, without words, if there wasn't another way, if it wouldn't be possible to stay a little longer. Not forever, just long enough that the loss wouldn't be total. The records began appearing again, not in the cabinets but scattered through the house. Small objects that evoked specific memories, carefully chosen not to overwhelm. A book left open on a page he recognized emotionally. A glass of water set beside the bed on the exact night he'd felt the most tired. The system had learned to soften. He recognized the strategy immediately, and that changed everything. Before, this reorganization would have worked. He would have read it as care. He would have accepted it as proof of a love that had matured. Now he could see it clearly. It was survival. Not physical survival, existential. The mansion didn't want to vanish as meaning. It wanted to remain a reference point, even if it was no longer the final destination. Love didn't shout anymore. It didn't press. It simply offered gentler versions of itself. And that made the choice harder, because there was no clear villain now, no cruelty, only a silent request for minimal continuation. He felt the weight of that request with unexpected intensity, not because he wanted to give in, but because he could empathize. He understood now that this love had been built without alternatives. It had never learned to exist outside permanence because it had never been invited to. All it knew was holding on. Now, facing the end, it was trying to learn something new in a hurry. He stopped in the main hall and stood there in silence, feeling the mansion shift around him. There was no automatic comfort anymore, but there was still memory, and memory, when it isn't recognized, tends to become an argument. That was when he made a subtle but final decision. He wouldn't reject the attempt with violence. He wouldn't crush it with coldness, but he wouldn't accept it either. He understood that negotiating with the system was just a more elegant way of extending the cycle, that accepting a little would only prepare the ground for a total return later. If the ending was real, it would have to be complete, not immediate but irreversible. The mansion seemed to understand. The adjustments slowed, then stopped. The offers lost their intensity. Objects stopped appearing. The space returned to something neutral, almost empty. There was no reproach, only resignation, like someone realizing too late that they can't be everything forever. Love didn't beg anymore. It didn't reorganize anymore. It waited. And this waiting was different from everything that came before. It wasn't strategic waiting. It was the waiting of someone who no longer has tools to prevent what's coming. He felt the weight of it with painful clarity. The next step wouldn't require a confrontation or an external choice. It would require a conscious goodbye. The goodbye didn't begin with internal speeches or symbolic gestures. It began with the absence of intention. For the first time since he arrived, he stopped waiting for something from the mansion. He didn't expect answers, reactions, signs of approval or disapproval. He just walked, and walking without expectation changed everything. The house noticed, not as a conscious entity, but as a structure sensitive to the meaning that sustained it. Each space he passed through now seemed slightly duller, less defined, as if sharpness depended on emotional investment that was no longer being offered. It wasn't destruction, it was gradual dissolution. He passed through the library without stopping. The books didn't call him. The scent of old paper felt weaker, almost ordinary. What had once carried symbolic weight was now just accumulated material. Memory, without the need to be reactivated, began to lose force. In the hallway of portraits, he slowed down, not from attachment, but recognition. The painted faces no longer seemed attentive. Many were smeared, as if the paint had been slowly diluted overnight. There was no explicit suffering in their expressions, only a gentle, dignified fading, like memories finding rest when they stopped being revisited. He understood then that saying goodbye didn't require dramatic rupture. It didn't require denying the love or devaluing what had been lived. It required only one thing, not replacing it, not filling the opening space with new promises, new systems, new forms of control. The temptation to replace was strong, to build another meaning, another refuge, another narrative that could keep the feeling of belonging alive. But he resisted, not out of willpower, but understanding. Replacing it would only restart the mechanism in a different form. The mansion began to lose cohesion. There were no visible cracks, but there were lapses. A corridor that felt shorter than it should. A room that couldn't hold the same temperature. Silence that no longer organized itself around him. It was just silence. He sat on the main hall floor and stayed there for a long time. Not to think, but to let absence settle in without trying to fill it. The discomfort was real. The loneliness was real. But for the first time, they weren't threats. They were temporary states. The love that had held the mansion together now felt distant, not from abandonment, but impossibility. Without investment, without repetition, without promise, it had no way to manifest, and that didn't make it false, only finite. The night moved on without ritual. No secret room appeared. No object was shifted. The house no longer tried to draw his attention. The system was wearing itself out, not from an outside attack, but from a lack of emotional fuel. That was when he understood that the real goodbye wasn't leaving the mansion in that moment. It was allowing it to stop being necessary, staying physically present while the emotional bond fully unraveled. When he accepted that, something inside him quietly rearranged itself. There was no immediate relief, no sense of victory. There was space, uncomfortable but real, where something new could exist without needing to be forcibly protected. The mansion didn't react, and that absence of reaction was the clearest confirmation of all. The cycle was finally losing its support. The last remnant didn't arrive as a surprise. It revealed itself with the naturalness of something that had always been there, waiting only for the moment when every other layer had been stripped away. There was no sound, no abrupt shift in the air, just the clear sense that something, at last, wanted to be seen without disguise. He noticed it when he walked the old corridor again, the one that led to the stone chamber. The space felt even rawer than before, as if it had been emptied of any remaining attempt at meaning. The air carried no emotion at all. It was neutral. Exact. A place where nothing could be softened. In the center of the room, something had changed. No new object had appeared, no hidden door. What was there was organized absence, a clean, bounded space as if something had been removed with extreme care. That absence had weight. Not like a recent loss, but like something held in place for so long that its removal left a visible outline in the air. He understood without effort that this space was the core of the request. It wasn't a request for permanence. It wasn't a request for return. It was a request for recognition. The love that had sustained the mansion no longer wanted to survive by force. It wasn't negotiating for continuity. It only needed to be seen for what it had been, a desperate attempt to prevent the extinction of meaning, too human a gesture to be judged as nothing but a mistake. He stayed there in silence, letting the density of that request settle into place. There was no demanded guilt, no debt, only the need not to be reduced to a faulty system or an impersonal prison. Love wanted to be remembered as love, even in its excess, even in its error. That understanding brought an unexpected emotion, not sadness, but gratitude, not for what had been imposed, but for what had been felt. The love, distorted as it was, had been real. It had sustained lives. It had defeated forgetting again and again, and now it accepted, difficultly, with dignity, that it couldn't continue existing in that form. He understood then that the final gesture wouldn't be leaving immediately, or destroying the mansion, or erasing the records. The final gesture would be simple and absolute, to let that love exist only as recognized memory with no future function, no promise, no return, no rep. When he accepted that, he felt something shift in his chest, not sharp pain, but a deep, quiet relief, like setting down something heavy after carrying it for too long. The system, without an active request, without investment, began to power down completely. The mansion reacted almost imperceptibly, a slight change in the acoustics, a different echo to his breathing. Nothing dramatic, just signs that the structure was no longer being held up by continuous intent. He left the stone chamber with slow steps. There was no urgency. Time now resumed its simple, linear movement. Each step was just a step, not part of a cycle. When he reached the main hall, the space looked larger and emptier at once, like a place that had fulfilled its purpose and was now waiting only for rest. There was no sadness in it. There was closure. The request had been met. The love had been seen, named, honored, and that was all that remained to be done. The transformation didn't happen as collapse. There was no dust, no walls giving way, no predictable spectacle of something ending violently. The mansion wasn't saying goodbye in ruins. It was saying goodbye in silence, a silence unlike any other that had ever lived inside that space. He noticed it first in the texture of the air. Once dense, almost attentive, it now felt ordinary, breathable in a simple, indifferent way. The environment no longer responded to him. It didn't adjust, didn't watch, didn't accompany. It was just space. Walking the corridors, he realized some details had become less defined. Not blurred, generic, as if the house were losing specificity. What once carried intense memory now was only form: wood, stone, glass. The mansion was beginning to behave like any old building abandoned by meaning. The portraits vanished without fanfare. They didn't fall from the walls. They didn't dissolve before his eyes. They simply weren't there the next time he walked that corridor. In their place, bare walls, marked by subtle shifts in tone where frames had hung for too long. The absence didn't hurt. It only confirmed. The library was the most affected. The books remained physically present, but they felt unreadable, not because the letters had disappeared, but because the impulse to open them, to search, to stay, had dissolved completely. The stories that had held that place together no longer asked for readers, and then he felt something he had never felt inside the mansion: neutrality, not comfort, not threat, just the clear sense that the space no longer needed him, and he no longer needed it. The real goodbye was happening there, not when you leave, but when the place stops calling. As he neared the front door, he saw the outer gate standing open again, just as it had been the day he arrived. Not as invitation, not as trap, simply open, like something that no longer needed to be controlled. Beyond it, the road looked sharp again, real depth, real distance. The world outside regained texture. He stopped before stepping out, not from doubt, but for one last recognition. He looked back one final time. The mansion still stood, whole but strangely empty of intention, like a body after the end of a story. There was no suffering, no attachment, only rest. He understood then that the love he had found inside no longer needed to exist as structure. It could exist only as honest memory, without function, without promise, without an embedded return. When he crossed the threshold, he felt something new, not euphoric relief, not crushing sorrow, continuity. The simple, powerful sense that life continues without demanding repetition. The door didn't close behind him. There was no longer any need. The mansion didn't watch. It didn't wait. It didn't record. It remained as a possible memory, not a destination. And as he took his first steps down the road, he realized something essential. Love that learns how to end doesn't disappear. It only changes where it lives. It leaves the structure and fits back inside life. The path ahead didn't present itself as a promise. There was no sign of immediate redemption, no comforting sense that everything would make sense from that point on. What there was simple continuity, almost austere, one step after another. The weight of his body in motion, the steady sound of his breath keeping pace with the world. He realized, with some surprise, that walking required more effort than staying. Outside the mansion, there was no emotional cushioning. Each thought arrived unfiltered, each memory surfaced without mediation. Life returned to its original shape, imperfect, unstable, too open to guarantee safety. And still, there was something profoundly right about it. The mansion didn't follow. It didn't insinuate itself as constant longing. It didn't appear as recurring temptation. It stayed where it had always been, in the past. A past now bounded, with defined edges, incapable of invading the present unless invited. He understood that the love he had lived there hadn't vanished. It still existed, but differently. Not as a structure organizing reality, not as an argument for future choices. It existed as a quiet lesson, an ethical reference, A steady reminder that loving isn't preventing an ending, but crossing it with dignity. In moments of silence, images came. Not the whole house, but details, the texture of wood beneath his hand, the distant scent of lavender, the light filtered through tall windows. Those images didn't hurt, they didn't call. They simply passed through, the way honest memories do when they aren't being used as shelter. He began to understand that the true prison had never been the mansion. It had been the refusal to accept that everything alive carries within it the possibility of an ending. The love he found inside had never meant to free him because it was built from fear. Fear of losing, fear of being alone, fear of moving forward without guarantees. Now, outside that space, he carried something different. The courage not to turn love into a prison. Days moved forward without grand events. Small choices, small mistakes, small joys that didn't need eternity to be real. He saw that the world didn't offer the same concentrated intensity as the mansion, but it offered something more honest, movement. There were moments of doubt, moments when the outside silence felt too big. But in those moments, he remembered not the comfort of the house, but the cost that comfort demanded. He remembered that peace, bought by force, always charges interest that's too high. Love now didn't need to be absolute. It could be fragmented, temporary, imperfect, and precisely because of that, alive, he kept going, not like someone escaping a cursed place, but like someone who learned, late and still in time, that loving is letting something end without trying to replace it with control. The mansion stayed behind, the cycle was closed, and what remained wasn't emptiness. It was space, space to exist without promises, space to love without holding, space to live without returning. And in that open space, he finally understood. The love that finds the courage to end is the only kind that doesn't need to imprison you to exist.